So I just got done watching the testimony with Isabella Guzman, the administrator of the SBA, and members of Congress in the Small Business Committee. And they had questions ranging everywhere from more PPP funding to fraud to restaurant revitalization, all across the board. There's a very, very wide variety of questions here, but I wanted to do a summary to break down this more than 2.5-hour testimony into about 10 minutes. That way you get everything you need to know and you don't have to sit through these testimonies, which are, I mean, as dry as can be. Absolutely so dry and frustrating to watch. So let me just give you a summary of everything that happened here. First off, just to start, this testimony was supposed to be with the SBA Administrator Isabella Guzman and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Now, from the very start, there was a clear frustration to Janet Yellen in this testimony because Janet Yellen was not present. And this is especially frustrating because, as many representatives cited, it is literally law for Janet Yellen to be there during that testimony. And this committee was frustrated, rightfully, because it kind of highlighted that maybe Yellen and the Treasury just simply don't care about these programs anymore. They don't care about the funding left, not enough to follow the law and actually be there to answer questions. This is especially frustrating for me because that is the person who could answer more questions about funding allocation, and potential, additions to these programs. So there's some definite frustration there. There was more questions just addressed to the actual administering of the various SBA programs. So a lot of the questions were more focused on that because Yellen was not part of this testimony. So we're going to bounce around in the various topics. It ranges all over the board. So first one is EIDL fraud. There's a lot of questions about EIDL fraud, which was a bit of a surprise to me, but it's a rightful concern. So the GAO has reported a ton of fraudulent activity in the EIDL program, and the SBA administrator was asked many questions about this, what they're doing to combat this, and specific facts and figures in the fraud of this program. Now, she didn't have the facts and figures on hand, and the basic gist here was that fraud was pretty darn rampant in 2020 when the program first opened up for the EIDL advances especially. But now, once they have more controls with this program and they request more documentation, fraud hasn't been quite as bad. But again, we didn't have the exact facts and figures here. And there was also questions as to whether maybe that we should continue this program with private lenders instead of all it being administered by the SBA, and maybe that would actually be cheaper for the US taxpayer. Now, on paycheck protection forgiveness, there was quite a few questions here, but most of them were targeted more to larger loans and forgiveness. So I guess first starting off with the smaller loans. A substantial number of the smallest borrowers have not submitted yet for forgiveness for their 2020 loans. Now, basically no one has submitted for forgiveness for a 2021 loan, and many borrowers haven't even opened up their portals yet. But for 2020 loans, about 40% of loans have not submitted for forgiveness yet, or they're waiting for forgiveness. And there was questions as to whether forgiveness should be streamlined for loans between $150,000 to $2 million, like they are streamlined for loans under $150,000, where all you have to do is fill out that form 3508S, don't have to send in any documentation, and you really just get forgiveness by certifying, that you spent the funds on the correct things in whatever your covered period was. So it's very simple for loans under $150,000. Over $150,000, it's a little bit more complicated. Over $2 million, it is much more complicated. So there actually is consideration, and there's outreach may be necessary to try and get this remaining 40% of borrowers in 2020 to submit that form for forgiveness. So there's consideration as to making the process easier, and they're saying they may do outreach. There was also a fact brought up by one of the representatives who says it appears that no loans have been forgiven yet for over $2 million, which I thought was interesting. And the reason for this is the SBA actually is going to do a manual review for each and every loan over $2 million. And according to that representative, none of them have been forgiven yet. Now, on the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, there was a lot of concerns and issues here with race. So this is kind of a hot topic, so I'm just going to kind of say what they said. So what happened here is there was a priority group for minorities with the restaurant revitalization, and the program ran out of funding before other groups received funding here. And there was representatives questioning as to whether this is fair, as to whether this may actually be potentially racist to only allow that priority group to receive funding and no one else receive funding. And what the general thoughts are on this. Of course, this is a question that didn't really get answered, but I thought it was worth bringing up. Also on the EIDL loan increase. So the EIDL program has been increased, the maximum loan has been increased from $150,000 to $500,000 recently. And the SBA administrator was applauded for, making that increase. And the program is expected to be increased to a maximum loan amount of $2 million very soon. Now, this isn't going to also increase the number of months that this covers. So on the last increase from $150,000 to $500,000, it increased the number of months of eligible expenses from 6 months to 24 months. Now, this next increase isn't going to increase it from 24 months of cost to 36 or something like that. It's just going to make eligible larger loans, and that's something that they still plan on doing. Now, on the Paycheck Protection Program in the next round, Representative Carter asked if the next round of PPP will be easier for the smallest businesses to get funding. Now, I thought that this was interesting in how they phrased that question, because they phrased it like it was inevitable that more PPP funding would be coming in another round. Now, I would take that with a grain of salt because that was the only person who referenced the PPP program in that way, but I just thought it was curious and worth mentioning. Administrator Guzman stated that they are taking items from their restaurant revitalization fund on how to speed up the program and make it easier, make other programs easier, like the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, by taking aspects from that. And that may be something that they could look at with the Paycheck Protection Program if there are additional rounds passed in the future. Now, on enhanced unemployment benefits, there was actually quite a bit of talk and questioning on this, which was a surprise to me. Many representatives expressed issues with the current benefits, with the additional unemployment benefits running through early September. And there was many questions about, hey, should we target this a little bit more to specific areas that are most in need? What should we do? Because what's happening is these representatives have their constituents reaching out to them saying, hey, I run a small business, I'm not able to hire anyone, and they're pointing to unemployment as the reason why they can't hire anyone, because people just want to stay on unemployment because they're making more money on unemployment. So there was a lot of questions directed to the administrator like, hey, what are your thoughts on this? The administrator, of course, didn't really give any opinions there, but I think it's good to question these kinds of things, of course. Now, there was also several questions brought up about communication issues with the SBA. So I don't know exactly how many, but maybe 10 representatives complained about the SBA's ability to respond to their questions and concerns. So like actual representatives, U.S. representatives were complaining, saying, hey, we've reached out to your office many times. You're not sending anything back to us. The Administrator Guzman just continually said that she works on being transparent here, and they try to answer questions as soon as possible. And many representatives were like, hey, that's not good enough. I've sent you, there was even people who were like, I sent you a letter on April 10th, April 11th, April 17th, on and on and on, and you haven't responded once. But the last administration responded much, much more quickly. What's going on here? There wasn't really much of an answer. And that's kind of something that just happens with these testimonies. First off, most of the questions aren't even good when you watch these testimonies. Maybe there's 200 questions asked in an entire testimony in an entire 2.5 session. And of that 200, maybe 20 are actually good questions. And then of that 20, maybe 5 questions are actually answered in a satisfactory manner. And that's just how these things go. They're not set up very well, but we can pull what we can from these, and that's what I'm trying to do with this video. So moving on from here, the PPP has been closed except for minority lenders. So the question here was, what kind of notice did you, the SBA, give lenders that portals were going to be closing for non-minority borrowers? Was this just sprung up on lenders? And according to lenders, it was. And according to even the White House, they weren't aware that funding was going to run out as quickly as funding did. Now, the SBA administrator said it shouldn't have come as a surprise that funding ran out and that they closed the portals when they did. But if you ask any lender, it seems like an opposite story. So I I don't really buy that personally. One thing that was a piece of positive news here is the SBA administrator said that loans with hold codes are still being worked through. So this is very positive information for anyone who is sitting with some kind of secondary review, some kind of issue at the SBA where the SBA thinks maybe you had some kind of bankruptcy that maybe you didn't. The SBA thinks that you applied for multiple loans for the same business when you shouldn't have, various issues and hold codes. The administrator is saying that they are working through those hold codes and those should all be worked through. Now, another question on top of this is how will the SBA use the month of June to clear those error codes? So as of right now, you can apply for the program through the end of May. Now, this is really only for minority borrowers at this point, but then through the entire month of June, the SBA still has time to process. And this is when most of those error codes are going to be worked through. And the administrator said that the SBA is going to do their best to request information and clear issues for those borrowers in June. So if you're sitting with an error code, it may be until mid to the end of June before this is actually resolved for you, but hopefully this is actually resolved for you, especially if it's something that was no fault of your own. That's especially frustrating. Now, there was also many questions about the increase of capital gains and the corporate tax rate directed towards the SBA administrator. So many representatives questioned the SBA administrator and her thoughts on the proposed tax increases under Biden's new plan with his infrastructure bills and things like that. And pretty much every representative who asked a question here was very, very visibly frustrated by the administrator's knowledge on the topic, or I guess maybe she has knowledge on it, but she just was not expressing the facts and figures that she has. And she had very little opinion or answers citing the SBA and anything having to do with taxes and the effects on small businesses. Now, like I said, many representatives were extremely frustrated by this because they were saying, hey, your job is literally to be the champion of small businesses. How do you not have an opinion on something as significant as taxes? And why won't you answer the question, do you think taxes affect small businesses? And of course, there wasn't really much of an answer to that, but I think that was a good question to ask. Again, with what you see with these testimonies is you get both sides. You get one side where it's like people who kind of want to attack the person who's testifying, and then the other side who are like on the side of the person testifying and saying, no, you're doing everything right. So it's just this weird combination where there's very few like level-headed questions that actually get through. Another question that was asked is, should we replenish the restaurant revitalization fund? And this was kind of the most clear answer that we received in the entire testimony. And the administrator said that this has been a very successful program and the SBA will be happy to administer additional funds if allocated by Congress. So what I've said in the past is I think if the Restaurant Revitalization Fund gets more funding, that increases the odds of more funding for the Paycheck Protection Program dramatically, because it'd be much easier to just, combine these issues together, one bill, sign that off, because why would you fix one problem and not another that are so closely related, both helping small businesses? I think that would definitely help. Now, one glaring issue with this testimony is there was very little talk about additional funding for the Paycheck Protection Program. Now, this is mostly because Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, was not there, and a lot of those questions would have been directed towards her. So that's extremely frustrating. Maybe there'll be an additional testimony in the future. But this was the main reason that I was really, really hoping to see answers and get some insights as to what may happen there. Now, it does seem like many representatives are all for continuing the success of these programs. So I think there are many representatives that would actually vote for additional funding here, but there just unfortunately wasn't a whole lot of talk on actually adding funds here or opening up the EIDL grant to all individuals, all businesses. There was zero questions about opening that $10,000 grant up to everyone, or even new ways to calculate or to qualify the $10,000 grant, like we've talked about on this channel before. That low income criteria disqualifies many businesses who are in need and are just as eligible as their neighbor across the street who is in a low income census tract. And there's many good ideas on how you could open this up, make it a little bit more flexible. That way it's not just these rigid guidelines where your business is located. You either get funding or you don't. There's ways to make this more successful, and unfortunately there was no questions asked about this. I wish I could be on this panel, but then again, I don't know how anyone actually gets a straightforward answer on these kinds of testimonies. So this was a summary of everything that was spoken on here. If you appreciate me watching this 2.5-hour testimony and paring it down into, what is it, about 14 minutes, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and I will keep you updated on all things small business funding. So thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a profitable day.